Morning, Grace-Toti. We are into July and keeping our eyes on the Lord, but also on Israel. And we learned last time that while God does put people under trial or in a place of temptation or through a period of testing, those are all outside circumstances meant to show us that we can't, but He can, to make us stronger, to make us wiser, to open our eyes as to who our true friends are, to teach us to pray, to find strength from a cool passage in His Word. A lot of lessons we can learn. But God never tempts anyone to sin from the inside, luring or influencing the heart to do wrong. Power of sin, which permeates this earth suit, which the Bible calls the flesh, is what takes temptation, swirls it around in the imagination, and then turns it into bad action. Now, these refugee Jewish Christians that James is writing to were actually blaming God for their sin, saying, He wasn't a God of blessings, He is a God of cursings, making their life hard, and they were just responding in the natural way. We also learned last time that outside circumstances cannot make us sin. We sin because our sinful hearts respond in natural but sinful ways. Now, on to today's passage. James writes in James 1, verses 16 and 16 to 18, Do not be deceived, my beloved brothers. Every good gift and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there's no variation or shadow due to change. Of His own will He brought us forth by the word of truth, that we should be a kind of first fruits of His creatures. So let's take it apart and look at it. God is like the sun. As you well know, there are days when we cannot see the sun. Here in South Africa, we have 300 days of sun on average each year, but in some areas of the world, like Ireland, you can have 300 cloudy days of the year. People go 4 and 5 months, often in winter, without seeing the sun, and they battle with SAD. That's not sadness, that's SAD, is S-A-D, seasonal affective disorder. They become depressed in a dysfunctional way. They have to move to another location. Alcoholism is huge in these areas. But we also don't see the sun when it's night. It is still there, but we have moved. So there are times when we could wag our finger at the sun and say, Where are you when I needed you? Some kind of sun you are. Some kind of medium yellow star you are. I speak as a fool. God is like the sun. He's always strong, always full, always warm, always radiant, always reliable. The trouble is not with the sun. The trouble's with the earth. Now it turns away so that it gets dark around us and clouds dump wind and rain on us. Now I still speak as a fool. If the earth stopped rotating and all clouds disappeared, your area would bake into a Sahara desert times 10. The cooling darkness, the mist, and the rain are critical for life to flourish and for fruit to grow. But we need that strong, full, warm, radiant sun behind everything else that's going on. God is like the sun. God is unchangeable. And our changes and shadows are not from any shadows or alterations in His character. He's not one of the gods of the pagans who were moody and emotional, loving at times and then lashing out at other times. Malachi 3 verse 6 says, For I, the Lord, do not change. Now, having said that, there is night, there are clouds. And that is what God's providence has built into the story of human history, allowing human sinfulness and the curse to run their natural courses. And there are times of great darkness and storms on the earth, where a few Christians are the light when all other lights have gone out. I think we're at the beginning of such a time. The coronavirus, the destabilization of economies and trade, the polarization of political power in most Western countries, the protests of the disenfranchised who feel that they have no voice in any political party and are thus challenging all authority in government and business and religion. And then on the other hand, the tightening of authority by right-wing governments, and beginning yesterday, the possibility that Israel might exert sovereignty over portions of the Palestinian West Bank, which will cause the world to go nuts. But above it all, the sun is shining. Like many of you have experienced the joy of flying on a gloomy day, and as the plane comes up out of the tops of the clouds, bumping as it goes through, you see that it's a sunny day. It just depends on your point of view. Now, James calls God the Father of lights in verse 17. I love that term. It means that he's the creator of the heavens, the sun, the moon, the planets, and yes, the stars. Psalm 136 says that he made the greater lights and the lesser lights. He is the Father of lights. God created light and separated it from non-light. Strangely enough, scientifically, darkness does not really exist as a thing, just like cold does not exist. Darkness and cold are words that describe the lack of light, the lack of warmth, which do exist. You can light a match in a dark auditorium, and all the darkness in that auditorium cannot put out that little light. You can carry a light, but you cannot carry a darkness. So God creates good things. Bad things come from ungood or evil, what the Bible calls darkness. So the misery faced by these refugee Jewish Christians was caused by fallen mankind. Yeah, sure, religious leaders who were imprisoning and killing Christians because they were different. They did not conform. They gave Christians no freedom of conscience, no freedom of religion. But God certainly ordained this sinful persecution of his own people. Why? Well, think of it. As they fled and spread out, so did the gospel to Samaria, to the uttermost part of the earth. In our own situation with the coronavirus, churches could not meet. Wow, remember that hard time in the lockdown? And yet churches went online with videos like this one and live streaming so that God's truth would go into the internet and stay on the internet. And people like some of you in other countries would listen to and learn from God's word. And if the rapture comes soon, at the Feast of Trumpets in September, Richard Alkins, God's truth will be left behind in the internet, and we, being gone, will still be speaking. Then James turns to the best of the good and perfect gifts. He says, of his own will, he brought us forth, brought us to life by the word of truth, that we should be a kind of first fruits of his creatures. James is saying that God initiated our salvation of his own will, his sovereign choice. God didn't just hope you would be saved. We serve a God who amazingly serves us. He's been working for thousands of years on your salvation and mine. God made the plan initially, allowing a substitute sacrifice for human sin. God came to us in the person of Jesus, God's Lamb, who was killed for our sin. God's Spirit carried the apostles along as they wrote down the New Testament. God made sure that his word was preserved through 2,000 years of church history and a copy put in your hands. Then God sent someone to explain the word of truth to you. Do you remember? It was God's Spirit that convicted your heart about your sin, the coming judgment, your hopeless condition, and convinced you that believing in Jesus, who he was and what he did, was the only way to be forgiven by God and reconciled to him. And when you believe the word of truth, the gospel, you were born again by God's Spirit. So, I can see in hindsight, man, God was involved with every aspect of my salvation, start to finish. And he's not finished. One day, I'll be delivered from this sinful, aging, and decaying body. And that brings us to James' last comment, that we should be a kind of first fruits of his creatures. We are the first of something new. What in the world does he mean? Well, under the law of Moses, the Jews were to give the very first pickings or cuttings of the harvest to the Lord. This is often the best of your crop. And by giving it to the Lord, you showed, number one, that the Lord was worthy of it. Number two, that you trusted him to give you a good harvest throughout the rest of the season. The last part of this big, massive thing called the gospel or good news is the physical restoration of all things. We really have hardly even started that. Our bodies and the earth will physically be changed. As you know, the earth and everything on it, including us, is under corruption, the curse of sin. When you're born again, though, your spirit is reborn, reconnected with God. His Spirit comes to live inside you. But Romans 8, verses 11 and 23 say that the Spirit, our onboard companion, is the device that God will use to change our mortal bodies into immortal, glorified bodies. So he's like the deposit on this final step. Eventually, after the current nations of the earth fall during the Great Tribulation, Christ's millennial kingdom will be set up. The curse on the earth will be lifted. But after that 1,000 years is up, then the entire earth will be refined and engulfed by fire, such that there will be this new heavens, a new earth, and an amazing capital city called the New Jerusalem. But this life in us now, this is the first step in this big, long restoration process that's going to be taking place. Starting with a few thousand believers when Jesus died, that little church grew to 13 million at the end of the first century. And now evangelicals say we're about 700 to 800 million believers on planet Earth. Maybe a tithe of the Earth's population. Kind of interesting. We are the first fruits. So don't be a bad apple today. Fully yield your life to the Lordship of Christ. He saved you, wants to use your life. Flowing through us, he can use us every day and every hour. Keep well. Have a great Thursday.